folks, today with us is Keith Stroup of Normal, founding member, I guess, founding leader of Normal. And he's going to start by just telling us a little bit about what Normal is.
Yes, we started Normal in late 1970, so we're in about our 53rd year now, I think. It was a result of some work I had done with consumer advocate Ralph Nader. A lot of students today may not even know who Ralph is, but he was the first lawyer who really popularized the concept of public interest law, where you use your law degree and your legal education to try to impact public policy rather than simply representing a number of individual clients. I was working with Ralph Nader in the late 1960s, and it was part of staying out of the Vietnam War. I was the generation, I graduated Georgetown Law School in 1968, and that was the height of the Vietnam War and also the height of the anti-Vietnam War activities. My generation, men, not women, back then they didn't want women in the military, but all men, when you turned 18, you were eligible for the draft. So unless you were a full-time student, you were drafted and sent to Vietnam. Now, that was a major incentive to keep a lot of us in school for as long as we could. But I graduated law school in 68, and I was still young enough I was subject to the draft. And in fact, I had my draft physical and given a reporting date of 2 or 3 weeks in advance, when, with the help of some good lawyers from the National Lawyers Guild who were representing people like myself, people that back then were called draft dodgers, if you remember. Some people thought we were being courageous. A lot of other people thought we were the worst scum on the earth. And so it was a difficult time, but I had a couple of fraternity brothers, undergraduate, who had been sent to Vietnam and came home in body bags. So I definitely did not want to go to Vietnam. With the help of these lawyers, I was able to get my draft board to give me what was called a critical skills deferment. And I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but it basically said if the work you have at home domestically is important to the health, safety, and welfare of the country, then you can stay where you are rather than go into the Army. I had been offered a job by a new presidential commission called the National Commission on Product Safety. It was totally the result of Ralph Nader's work, and Senator Warren Magnuson from Washington State was the main sponsor in the Congress. So they hired, I think they hired 8 lawyers. 4 of us were just out of law school and 4 were more experienced. What I learned during those 2 years, I ended up working right downtown Washington, D.C. at 16th and K. I learned about public interest law. I learned how you do it. I learned the benefit, publicizing injustice, working with the media, using that sort of leverage to try to impact public policy. So when the commission ended in, it would have been 1970, I was too old to be drafted. It was the first time in my life when I had a choice as to what I really wanted to do with my law degree. And I realized that I first started smoking marijuana when I was a freshman at Georgetown Law School. A lot of people start much younger. I was an alcohol drinker as an undergraduate, but at any event, by that point, I had been smoking marijuana for 5 or 6 years. And sort of naively and with some good bit of idealism, obviously, as I look back on it, it seemed to me what I wanted to do was to legalize marijuana. So I pulled together some friends. We founded Normal. And because of the work I'd done with Ralph, we set it up as a consumer lobby. That is, we were representing the interest of responsible marijuana smokers. And still today, 53 years later, we don't represent the industry. We're not trying to pick winners and losers and see who gets rich in the industry, although that's all fascinating to watch it work out. Our job was to make sure that responsible marijuana smokers are treated fairly in all aspects of their lives. The first step, of course, had to be to redefine the personal use of marijuana so it was no longer a crime. When we started Normal, the number of arrests in the country for marijuana offenses were somewhere around 300,000, but by the time of the end of the 70s, they were up to about 900,000 arrests a year. That's a lot of people who were having their lives permanently scarred. So Normal is, that's the way we formed it, and it still is today. We're the group that tries to make sure, for example, even in states where they no longer treat marijuana smoking as a crime, you can lose custody of your minor children. If a nosy neighbor smells marijuana smoke and calls the child welfare agency, they come out and examine your home, presuming it may be unfit to raise a child in. In other words, if you smoke marijuana, you must have a filthy home. That's the extension of reefer madness left over into the modern years. DUIDs, if you're pulled over for a traffic offense and you don't test positive for alcohol, they'll take a blood sample. And if you have any THC in your system, you are per se guilty of a DUID, driving under the influence of drugs. Now, we certainly don't support the idea of driving while you're impaired, but smoking marijuana only leaves you impaired for about an hour, maybe 90 minutes. But if you're a regular smoker, you'll test positive for marijuana for weeks, sometimes months after you last smoked. So we got to take care of that problem. We've got job discrimination. In most states today, even in most states that have legalized, there are a few states that have passed language that attempts to protect against unfair job discrimination. But in most of the states, if a private employer wants to maintain what they like to call a drug-free workplace, and it's not really drug-free because their employees are free to go out at lunch and drink 5 or 6 beers and come back,
or take prescription medication.
But that's right. So it's not truly drug-free. But if they want to do it, they can drug test their employees, and if you test positive, they can fire you or refuse to hire you if you're a new hire, even though marijuana is legal in that state. Well, we have a lot of work to do before we reach our ultimate goal of treating responsible marijuana smokers fairly in all aspects of their lives. But we've made enormous progress. The numbers of arrests today I think they're back around that 300,000 mark, way down from the 900,000. And as I say, we've got 23 states where they fully legalized marijuana for adults, regardless of why you smoke, and a total of about 38 states where the medical use of marijuana has been legalized. So I'm confident that over the next 5 to 10 years, we will legalize marijuana in every state all across the country, and we will change federal law. But we've still got some work to do.
Absolutely. So I actually want to jump in our time machine and go back a little bit. As you were talking about being in DC in 68, I couldn't help but wonder, my mom was in DC in 68 through 70. You guys probably actually hung out and maybe smoked some pot together. But in that time frame, as you were kind of figuring out, like, I want to advocate for people who are responsible cannabis users. Do you feel like you were taking on cases that were giving you hope to move the movement forward? Or do you feel like it was a really like an uphill battle? I'm just curious about like this, late 60s, early 70s. How did it feel to be fighting the good fight?
Well, again, I look back now and I realize that there was an enormous level of naivete that we were working with and idealism, but that's what being young is all about. I mean, you're going to have your youth be idealistic and shoot for higher goals. But an example to start with is that the Gallup polling organization in 1969, the year before we started NORML, for the first time asked the American public how they felt about legalizing marijuana. Literally, before that, it wasn't even considered important enough to ask the question. But in 69, when they asked it, 12% of the American public supported what we were trying to achieve, legalizing marijuana. 88% of the country were opposed to what we were trying to do. So we knew going in, it was going to be a significant challenge, but we thought we could do it if we eventually, one of two things, either turned on half of America, so they realized from their own experience that marijuana smoking was no big deal. You didn't need to treat it as a crime. All of the reefer madness propaganda had impacted a lot of people's attitudes. They'd lived through the 40s and 50s and 60s, and they really believed that if you smoked marijuana pretty quickly, you'd be a heroin addict. That used to be the main allegation, was marijuana leads to heroin. So it was challenging, but on the other hand, it gave us an opportunity because we were considered, what we were proposing was considered fairly radical at the time. It meant that you had access to major media. You could get on talk shows, Crossfire, the evening news. And so for those first several years, the reason people knew what we were doing was because what we were doing was considered radical, but it got us a chance to get on the stage. It got us a chance to explain our position. Now, the first really big break we had was in the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which was a terrible anti-drug bill. It's still, by the way, the federal drug bill, was still the Controlled Substances Act of 70. But at the time, when it was being considered by Congress, Congressman Ed Koch, who later became mayor of New York for several years, and when he was mayor of New York, he was a real conservative. But when he was in Congress, he was actually a progressive. And he had a daughter who was a teenage daughter, and I'm almost certainly, it's been so many years, I can't remember for sure the details, but I think she probably was a marijuana smoker. In any event, he became one of our early supporters. And as part of his efforts to begin to re-educate people about marijuana, he managed to get a provision inserted in the Controlled Substances Act that established what was called the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse. And at the time, we weren't expecting much from it, because the way it was set up, it was going to have 13 members, 4 of them from Congress. Congress would pick 2 members of the House and 2 members of the Senate, but it had 9 members appointed by former President Nixon. And Nixon just hated marijuana and hated the idea of legalizing marijuana. He at one point, he even accused he thought it was a conspiracy of a bunch of Jewish psychiatrists, was what he said at the time. But as I say, we started off not expecting a lot from the commission. But as it turned out, after the first year full study, when they reported back on marijuana, they shocked the world by recommending that we decriminalize minor marijuana offenses. They didn't use the word decriminalize back then, but it was that eliminate penalties for the possession and use of small amounts of marijuana. And they even included nonprofit transfer of small amounts between adults. When that recommendation came out, it gave us all of a sudden this major national report from a presidential commission that essentially agreed with us. Yeah. So we began to travel the country, identifying any legislator in any state who was willing to offer a version of decriminalizing marijuana, and knowing that they might be treated as a radical when they first introduced it, and if they didn't have some good support, they might lose the next election, because back then, being soft on drugs, they used to call it, was would end your career prematurely. So we spent several years going around and providing expert witnesses. We had members of law enforcement. We even had members of the commission, once that commission was over, that went with us. And if anyone was willing to introduce a decrim bill, we'd fly 5 or 6 witnesses out where they could put on a real impressive legislative hearing with well-qualified expert witnesses. So it didn't seem like such a radical idea. Now, the first few states that considered it, they considered it, but they didn't adopt it. The first state to adopt it was actually Oregon in 1973. And between 1973 and 1978, we passed decriminalization bills in a total of 11 states. And some of them were surprising. Mississippi, Nebraska, now some of them were the states you might anticipate. But at any event, we made enormous progress. And we thought at the time that it was only a matter of 4 or 5 years and we would have marijuana decriminalized nationwide. Well, we learned a lesson about how the pendulum of public opinion can change. And by the late 70s, early 80s, you had Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan and the parents groups and Just Say No, if you remember. Yeah. And their whole premise was that we shouldn't allow adults to do anything that would be inappropriate for children. That was literally, it was, the concern about kids was paramount. Even if they knew it wasn't really fair that we were criminalizing all these adults, they were arguing it was necessary in order to protect the children. Well, if you really think about that premise, if adults couldn't do anything that's inappropriate for kids, they couldn't drive or fly airplanes or ride motorcycles or have sex or sign contracts. I mean, there's all kinds of things that it's fine for adults to do. But that argument for about 10 years in this country held sway. And we actually lost support during those, from about 79 to about late 80. We saw our support decrease. Fortunately, we were able to maintain those 11 early victories. They tried to overturn them, but we had enough support they were not able to do it. So the first big phase of making progress towards legalization was that phase following the introduction of the Marijuana Commission.
Yeah, the 70s are such an interesting time for cannabis reform because, you know, and I was not born until 78, so I was not present for this, but I've certainly done a lot of research. And when I look at even paraphernalia and availability, you know, it's media, it's Cheech and Chong, and it's music, and it's but then also I remember seeing a frisbee that was like a puff puff pass.
Yeah, yeah.
You could smoke from the frisbee and then play. So there was this sort of paraphernalia that seemed very kid friendly. And for several years in the 70s, it seemed like, and some of my students, in fact, talk about this, who were alive in the 70s, they were teenagers, and they're like, yeah, you know, we were in middle school and it was a thing. Now, I want to get back for a second because you did mention Reefer Madness a couple of times. And this story to me is just, it's one of the things I love so much about your history and what NORML has done. Tell us about finding Reefer Madness and bringing it to the public.
Yes. It was in the early 70s, and I was as colleges began to hear about NORML, and we began to form some college chapters and things like that. I began to get invitations to come out and lecture at various campuses, and they paid a small fee. You didn't raise a lot of money, but we raised every appearance. We'd get our expenses paid, maybe $1,000 or $1,500, and that helped us get a budget to do our work from. Well, after doing a few of them, I realized that first off, I had an agent, forgetting the name of it right now, but the agent was who told me about the availability of Reefer Madness. I knew about the movie Reefer Madness, but I presumed somebody owned the rights to it or whatever. I didn't think it was in the public domain. Well, as it turns out, as this agent alerted me, it was actually available from the Library of Congress. Whoever originally had made it had allowed the copyright to expire. So it was available for, I don't know what I paid, $25 or $50 to get a copy of it from the Library of Congress. Now, it was like an hour and a half long or something. And it was the same theme, just stretched out for an hour and a half. You know, they had a crazy guy playing the piano whose eyes were bugging out. And one of the allegations of Reefer Madness was that if you smoke marijuana, it would make white women want to have sex with black men.
Yeah.
You know, that was back in an era when interracial marriage and interracial sex was considered way off the line. So I took it to a friend who was an editor and edited it down to where it was only about 30 minutes long. And when I would go give my lectures at college campuses, after I gave the lecture, I'd have them turn the lights down and I'd put on this abbreviated version of Reefer Madness. And of course, everybody in the audience would light up a joint since the lights were off. And I would go back and smoke with them in the audience. And so for several years, it was probably our principal fundraising initiative that we made. Now, that wasn't where we got most of our funding. Most of our funding came from the Playboy Foundation back then. Hugh Hefner had heard about us and invited me out at some point, and they were into personal privacy and personal freedom. They weren't just interested in sexual things. So they were very sympathetic to what we were doing. Also, Hugh Hefner was someone who had quit drinking alcohol years earlier, but he enjoyed smoking marijuana. So he had a personal stake or a personal interest in what we were doing. So for a long time, they provided us, I think it was $100,000 a year in funding and a couple of free full-page ads in Playboy magazine. And back then, Playboy magazine had a circulation or a subscribership of 6 million, and each issue was passed around to 4 people. So long before you had social media and we didn't have individual ways to reach large numbers of people, if you could argue your case in Playboy magazine, you were reaching 20, 25 million people every month. And so anything we would do during those years where we would get some poor kid out of prison who had been busted for a half an ounce in college and sent away in Texas or Missouri or different states, we would bring in some of our lawyers, appeal the case. And in several cases, we were able to get people out of prison who were serving long terms. Well, Playboy would focus in an upfront news section. They would focus on those successes. So in large part, as I traveled around the country, the reason people knew about us was largely because they had read about us in Playboy magazine. Now, frankly, I didn't know at first whether we should even take support from Playboy. I was concerned about whether we would be tainted by that. We were public interest types. We were trying to be idealistic. We didn't want to be sexist or misogynist or whatever. So one of the people I went to talk about it was former Attorney General Ramsey Clark. Ramsey had published a book in 1970 called Crime in America, which I had read. And for those who may not remember Ramsey, he was both Attorney General, but he also, his father was Supreme Court Justice Tom Clark, who had to step aside as senior justice in order for his son to take over as Attorney General for Lyndon Johnson. So I had, in his book, Crime in America, he had argued for legalizing marijuana, and I was surprised indeed. So I managed to go visit him and get to know him and ask him what he thought about our project. And he encouraged me to do it. He said, I think it's terribly important. He also said, do it while you're young, because if you fail, you're young enough, you can start over again. That wasn't terribly reinforcing, but it was realistic. So I asked him, one of the things I asked him was, I said, Ramsey, we've been offered some funding from Playboy, but I'm nervous about whether we should accept it. And at that time, frankly, we didn't have any funding. We were just working, it was a volunteer effort working out of my home. And Ramsey said, no. He said, by that point, he'd been Attorney General. He'd published several books. But he said, as he traveled around the country, most of the people that came up to him, the reason they knew him and knew about him and knew about what he thought about public policy was what they had read in Playboy. So he said, I absolutely recommend you do it.
That's really interesting. And it's, the idea of looking a gift horse in the mouth, right? If you didn't have any other funding. But as it turns out, what a phenomenal way to not only reach a large market, but I think there's sort of a subversiveness to Playboy, certainly, right? And then I think in later years with publications like High Times, you kind of get your notoriety where you can. No press is bad. All press is good press, that sort of thing. But
in some ways, that's true. By the way, High Times didn't get started until 1974.
Yeah.
And the fellow who started it was a man named Tom Forsyth. He was a marijuana smuggler. He literally flew a plane and smuggled large amounts of marijuana, usually I think from Colombia, but some from Mexico, into the United States. I had first met him in 1972 at the Democratic National Convention in Miami. And at that time, I just thought of him as a smuggler who was fairly out front and was kind of interesting to meet, but I didn't realize that he was about to start a magazine. But he did in 74, High Times, and they also began to fund NORML. And indeed, from like 1980 forward, they were our major funder for several decades. And you're right, we were depending for our communication with the public on two too hot to touch publications, where for a lot of people, as a teenage boy back in those years, we were all caught at some point with a Playboy magazine under our mattress, and so it was a little racy to even think about it. Well, the same thing was true about High Times.
Yeah.
Back then, remember, even rolling papers were illegal. Yeah. They were considered paraphernalia. You think now of rolling papers, my God, they're every place. Who could care what's the difference? But no, back then, if you were caught with rolling papers and a little bit of marijuana, you'd get charged with both marijuana and a paraphernalia charge. So we depended on a risque communication system in those early years.
Well, it seems to have paid off. And I think, in the end, that's also sort of your audience, people who were smoking cannabis or regular cannabis users, also people who were advocating for legalization or the ability to smoke cannabis responsibly. This is not necessarily a group of people who are on the straight and narrow anyway. So you kind of spoke right to your audience and then had the support that you needed to keep going for, as you pointed out, several decades.
Yeah, we reached a point where that association was very helpful for us. It made us a little bit famous in the fringes, of society, so that at least people knew who we were. I mentioned that when we started off, we only had 12% support of the American public. Well, just to see how that changed, today there are now, I think, 5 national polls, including Gallup, that shows 70% of the American public now support full legalization. Almost 90% support legalizing medical use. So what happened, we thought when we started that in order to win this, we probably had to turn on half of the American public, because we were assuming that the only support we were going to get was from people who had actually smoked a marijuana joint at some point and realized that it didn't turn them into a raving maniac, and that these exaggerated claims were silly. Well, it turns out that's not what happened at all. The people who have smoked marijuana at some time in their life is roughly 1 out of 2 adults in this country. But that's having smoked once in your life. People who are consider themselves regular smokers, it's between 14 and 15%. It's almost identical whether you're black or brown or white, which is interesting, even though obviously the minority communities have suffered a lot more than whites have. The actual smoking rates are almost identical. But what happened is the majority of the American public finally figured out, it took them a lot longer than we thought it should, that prohibition causes more problems than the underlying drug itself. And so even though most Americans still don't smoke, 70% of them now support full legalization. So it's sort of in the Vietnam era, they used to talk about winning the hearts and minds of the American public. Well, that's what we did. Over those decades, we gradually won the hearts and minds of a majority of the American public.
Yeah, and I love to see, so NORML as an organization played an enormous role in that, alongside a shifting popular culture. I think High Times had a lot to do with that. There were certainly popular culture elements of the 70s and 80s. And then looking at hip hop culture in the 90s and the early 2000s. In fact, I just watched a documentary about Cypress Hill. I'm not sure if you know who,
Cypress Hill's been pro-pot from the very beginning.
And that was a big part of the documentary, was talking about how they took that stance and it paid off for them, but it also paid off, I think, for a pro-cannabis movement. Even people who aren't consuming cannabis, if you see people around you consuming it responsibly, if you yourself have once consumed it responsibly, and then also hearing stories about, for instance, children who have seizure disorders who actually benefit from cannabinoids in their system, or people who are suffering from terminal illness. There's so many examples of beneficial use, and I think it's taken a long time, to your point, but we've gotten to a point, not across the entire United States, but in many states and in many pockets of the United States and, of course, around the world, where people are viewing this not as a drug, but as medicine, and seeing it in a different light. And one of the things that I think is so important about what New York State did in legalization is they didn't call it recreational legalization. They called it adult use.
Adult use, I agree.
And I love that language because it's recognition that not everybody is consuming cannabis as recreational use, but they may not be a medical patient. They might just need it at the end of the day for a little stress relief, or they may also enjoy it recreationally. There's so many different ways to use it. And if you're adult, it doesn't matter.
That's right. And by the way, to underscore that point you made about the importance medical use played in the overall legalization movement, I had mentioned that our early progress was based on the Marijuana Commission report in 1972. But after we won those 11 states, that last one was in 78, and the mood of the country turned more conservative, we went 18 years without another statewide victory. It was a very difficult period. And when it changed was in 1996, when California passed by voter initiative the medical use of marijuana. All of a sudden, when we surfaced again and when we had majority support, it had been redefined. It was no longer focused so much on right to privacy and civil rights and that sort of thing. It was based on the medical importance and the people, like you said, the young children who had Dravet syndrome and where prescription drugs were ineffective, but marijuana, in fact, seemed to be the only thing that helped those kids and stop having seizures. So the second phase of this, starting with California in 96, was state legislators were still skittish about supporting marijuana, even medical use, or a lot of them were still nervous. They knew privately that this was okay, but they didn't want to risk their career by voting for it. So the first 6 or 7 states that legalized marijuana, it was all by voter initiative. We had won the support of a majority of the American public in certain states, not all across the country.
Right.
So instead of getting bills introduced, we began to work with groups to collect signatures and put it on the ballot. We reached a point not so many years ago where we began to have enough support in state legislatures. Not, by the way, only about half of the states offer a voter initiative. People don't always realize that, but a lot of states, it was never put in their constitution, so they don't have the option. They have to go through the legislature. But we passed it in New Jersey legislative, New York legislative, Michigan, Illinois. Now, really big, massive states now, it's been passed through the legislature. So that opens up our ability to make progress in enormous ways that we didn't have. When you had to do it by voter initiative, you had to raise usually a couple of $1 million to even pay for the collection of signatures to qualify for the ballot. And then you needed another $1 million or $2 million to run a successful campaign, especially if it's in a big state. Obviously, if you can pass it through the state legislature, you can do that with a fairly modest budget if you have effective people working on the issue.
If a person's not personally invested, it's sometimes difficult to garner the support and get them on board. But how exciting that you're able to do that and work within some of these states to get those initiatives passed. And I think it's a powerful testament to, the power of the people, to borrow a phrase from the 60s.
It is indeed. By the way, let me point out one other thing about your new New York law that I think is especially important. It is the most forward-looking little sub-issue of the 23 states. The question is, what do you do about smoking? Where can you smoke once you've legalized marijuana? Well, in the first several states we passed, the only place you can legally smoke is at home, your home or someone else's home. The first ones didn't allow lounges. Now, the latest states, New York, New Jersey, et cetera, they do have licensing provision for lounges. I don't think they have any open yet, but they will be soon in most of those states. So you'll be able to meet with friends like alcohol drinkers meet at a bar and have a couple of beers. Well, you'll be able to go to a marijuana lounge and buy marijuana and smoke it in the lounge. But the really important thing New Yorkers did, recognizing that especially people, lower income people, if you live in a government subsidized housing, they don't allow any kind of smoking, tobacco or anything else. So you have no place to smoke. So the only thing you could do is take a walk in the park and smoke. And at that point, you're putting yourself at risk because it's illegal. New York had the common sense to say, any place it's legal to smoke tobacco, it is now legal to smoke marijuana. And that's exactly what every other state should do. And I would bet you over the next few years will do, because it makes sense. It begins now to treat all of us equally. It was always easy for white middle-class people to find a place they could smoke. It wasn't so easy for poor people and minorities who were living in government housing or subsidized housing or whatever. So I'm really proud of that provision of New York's law. And as I say, I think it will be copied by several others. In fact, Minnesota right now is going through a debate about whether to allow public smoking in Minnesota. And it appears under their new law, it wasn't outlawed. So I think the courts are going to determine it's allowed.
Well, and one of the things I love about that law as well, I actually was just in New York at the end of May or early June. In fact, that's where I met your colleague and had the opportunity to speak with them and get a chance to speak with you. But walking around the city and just, you could smell cannabis everywhere. People are smoking it, and it's just not a big deal. And what I think is so great about that is it normalizes it. For young, for old, for everybody who's walking around. If you see somebody standing on a street corner in Manhattan and they're smoking, and then they're crossing the street and they're going to work and they're doing whatever, and it's like, oh, it's just not a big deal.
No big deal. That's exactly right.
We have to normalize the use of this. It's certainly some people have demotivational syndrome, and that may be attributed to their cannabis use, and it might also just be attributed to their personality. But a lot of people are totally functional and love to use cannabis all day, whether it's an edible or smoking. They go to work, they raise children, they are completely functional and productive members of society. The more we normalize that, I think we're going to see that support get higher and higher, and leading us to an era of full legalization. So we have a couple more minutes. I just want to know what are your hopes and dreams, for the next few years in the United States around cannabis legalization?
Well, as we begin to get into a legal market in more and more states, the question becomes, how do we protect the craft growers, the small mom and pop operations, and keep the large tobacco and alcohol companies out of the damn area altogether? A fear we've always had, and I think a lot of smokers still talk about that on the social media, is they assume that at some point you're going to have the large alcohol and tobacco companies come in and control the market. I don't think that's necessarily so at all. I think we're going to end up with something that more nearly represents, say, the wine industry, where you have some big players, but you have tens of thousands of small vineyards and wineries all across this country, almost every state. Here, I live in Northern Virginia. We have several of them in Virginia. And to the extent that the federal law remains in place for a few more years, that gives these mom and pop operations a chance to really get on their feet and get established and get some brand recognition. Now, once the federal law is changed, and I don't think the federal law, when it's changed, is going to dictate how legalization goes. They're simply going to back out of the picture. That's what we did with alcohol prohibition. When it was ended, we didn't dictate that states had to all legalize alcohol again. We just backed the prohibition out federally and said you can do what you want. And that's exactly what, and there's still some counties around the country that are dry counties left over prohibition.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I think will happen with the federal law. Now, once they do that, then those big corporations are free to sell in interstate commerce. Right now, you cannot sell across state lines. And while that's a hindrance in terms of developing the industry, in the short run, it protects us from the big guys. And so I'm okay if it takes us another 5 or 6 years to change federal law. By then, I think most of the mom and pop operations will have had a chance to get established.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you said that. You know, my partner is a grower and he's working with a cooperative in Massachusetts, and has forever been an advocate of craft cannabis.
Yeah.
So I support that dream as well. And I'm really looking forward to a day when, you know, it's not just multi-state operators and large scale growers, but that truly when it's grown in a small way with care and love, that you get this incredible medicine and this beautiful flower. And I think if more people can have access to that, it's going to change more minds.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
As a committed marijuana smoker of 50 some years, I really do think the craft marijuana is a higher quality, better quality marijuana. What you're going to see when the big corporations come in, you're going to lower the quality, you're going to increase the price, all the things that happen with big corporations. So we kind of have a free zone here for a few more years to improve our systems internally.
I think there will always be people who prefer to drink Budweiser or get, you know, high THC, but not necessarily medicinally impactful, cheap cannabis. There's always going to be a market for that, but there will also always be a market for people who want craft. Yeah, so wonderful. Thanks again.
Thank you.